Welcome to the Montessori Mic. I'm your host, Tatenda, and today we are joined in the studio with Makomborero Muropa, all the way from everywhere in the world, literally. So Mako, where in the world are you?
I am currently in Zimbabwe back home, and it's good to be back. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Where have you been? You just said you've just got home. Where
Yeah,
have
I've
you
been
been?
in
Where were you?
Mexico. I was participating in the Ford Global Fellowship, first in-person gathering for our cohort, which brings together diverse leaders from all over the world into a very powerful cohort of about 30 people from across different walks of life to come together and co-create pathways for addressing the large questions of inequality across the world. So it was quite a wonderful gathering there in Mexico City.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for making time with, the travels and the jet lag, probably. So welcome to the Montessori Mic podcast, where we talk everything education and try to understand education through a Montessori experience, framework, lens. And I'm excited here today to be sitting in the studio with you to talk about Afrocentric Montessori and the politics of belonging. And we'll get into that. But first, let our viewers and listeners get to know you. Who is Mako? I just realized that I didn't get your bio ahead of time. So the good thing is you're here. So would you let people know who is Makomborero Muropa?
Thank you so much, Tatenda. And once again, it's such a pleasure to be on this show as we talk about all things Montessori. So my name is Makomborero Muropa. I am a lawyer by training, a passionate advocate for child's rights and education in a great number of spaces. I'm happy to have co-founded African Montessori Hub with Tatenda, the individual who is talking to me at this point in time, as we rethink and reimagine learning and education in the African context together, using Montessori as a lens. I also serve as the Vice President for Programs for Aslan Housing Foundation, where we talk about housing justice and think about pathways to afford ministry leaders, affordable housing in very, very costly markets in the US. I also work within communities as a trainer, as a responsive leadership coach, and as a mentor to several young people who are on the rise and who are emergent in a great number of spaces and capacities as they think of themselves as the next wave of leaders in Zimbabwe and abroad. So that's a little bit about me, and super excited to be bringing all of that into this conversation.
I think your professional bio really translate what it means to sit at the intersectionality of education, child's rights, housing, youth empowerment, everything that I'm excited to really unpack. Like, how did a lawyer by profession or trained lawyer end up in Montessori education and everything child's rights? But let's sort of like remove for a minute your professional background. If someone is just to know you without having to know you as a lawyer, as a VP of a housing foundation, as a board of director, who is Makomborero?
Mako is an artist. Mako is a passionate community developer. Mako is a brother, a partner, a friend, a son, and a peer to a great number of individuals. Mako is also a chef whenever he feels like it, and in other spaces as well. Mako is a teacher. Mako is a preacher. So absolutely all the above, all the instructive methods seem to find their abode within me. So I am all of those things. Yeah.
Is there an identity that you strongly identify with, that this is what shows up mostly, though I'm all these things, but I get to, or most people get to experience me as this Mako, perhaps the preacher? I don't know. I'm thinking of John the Baptist. I'm like, Mako the preacher sounds about good to me. But anyways, is there an identity that really resonates most, maybe every day in a more natural way, every day that shows up?
I believe it's probably Mako the poet. I think that identity shows up more often because it is the identity that I see, showing up regardless of the space that I'm in. My ability to articulate thoughts, feelings, intentions into words that we can convey across different fora. I believe that that's part and parcel of my poetic ability, and I see it shining in all these different spaces, and I resonate very deeply with that side of me. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Again, welcome to the podcast. So to get us started, let me start with having to read out to you some sentences, and you get to help me finish them. So, the African child deserves an education that
is wholesome, that looks like them, that is culturally responsive, and that liberates them.
A classroom begins to transform when
it is filled with joy. Yeah.
Too many children are taught to believe that
they can all be one thing and that there are limited options in the world.
An Afrocentric Montessori classroom should feel like
a playground.
When a child truly belongs, they begin to
see their neighbor as themselves.
Oh, thank you. Anyways, I think that's a very good way to sort of ease ourselves into what brought us here today to talk about Afrocentric Montessori. So for people who maybe hearing for the first time the phrase Afrocentric Montessori, how would you describe this in very simple but yet meaningful ways?
That's a great place to start. And it also starts with an affectation that says those two words don't actually belong together. But as African Montessori Hub and as passionate advocates for children using Montessori as a means, we believe that they do. There is a world in which Afrocentric and Montessori can coexist as twins who were always meant to be together. And for us, it starts from understanding what Montessori is. We understand Montessori as a pedagogy, as a method for letting children know more about what they're learning, the language of learning, the art of teaching. It is a methodology that allows children to be more inspired in the work based off of the principles that Dr. Maria Montessori ushered in at a very critical time in history, where there was need to give children a very immersive learning experience that was based on, really fostering the child's curiosity and independence, thinking more deeply about how play is included in the learning process, and also thinking about what mixed age groups can teach children who are growing up in different communities. Now, when we talk about an Afrocentric version of that, we're really locating what we've already been doing here in Africa to these principles, or at least locating these means and methods of teaching children across Africa, more so in Zimbabwe, where we actually house the work of African Montessori Hub. We are geolocating these principles and these methodologies to what we have always done, what has always been passed down from one generation to the other, and thinking about how we are able to spotlight and celebrate the ways of knowing and the ways of learning that our parents and our grandparents have always taught us in the home. That kind of learning does not always look like a classroom setup. It is learning that happens in the kitchen, in the bedroom, outside of the house, during apprenticeship in the fields, or in different spaces that have formed part and parcel of African socialization for millennia. So that is what we are trying to locate, the understanding that learning has always been taking place and continues to take place even outside the classroom, and often ushered in by the community, where in the home most of these things actually begin.
So I think we can't, talk about Afrocentric Montessori without having to admit that Montessori itself has always been framed in a Eurocentric way, right? I think when we talk about Afrocentric Montessori, we are trying to respond to ways in which Montessori has been experienced or has been framed, be it in the West or on the continent itself. What is your understanding of how Montessori is experienced, that which you are trying with the African Montessori Hub to either change or enrich or also bring about a different experience on the continent and hopefully to the rest of the world when you work within the framework of Afrocentric Montessori?
That's a great question. You're right. Montessori education has largely been the preserve of the very elite, the very wealthy, and oftentimes those who are at a certain level of society or a certain echelon where the greater portion of individuals do not exist. What we've also realized is that it is often priced out of many people's affordability, and tends to be, revered with a certain cultic, quality. And for us, we are thinking more deeply about what Dr. Maria Montessori's intentions were. We actually know that the entitlement of Montessori education actually came after her own legacy, and not necessarily to say that she coined it that way. And we believe that there is a commercialization that has taken over what Dr. Maria Montessori just wanted us to understand as the art of learning. And so we reclaim that intrinsic wisdom and the words that she shared across time to say we do not need to have Montessori being, the preserve of a very small portion of people in society. It is for everyone, because it goes to the heart of what we believe all children should be afforded. An education that is child-centered, an education that reflects who they are and their identity, an education that affirms that they also have agency, that they are full citizens and fully present, in the learning process. An education that really empowers them to think on their feet, to be critical, to be independent, to also learn through joy by discovering for themselves how things work, how things move, and where things belong in the world. So we actually believe that for us, the disruption that African Montessori Hub's work does is to remind us that Montessori education is for all, because it is already in all. We find it in all the African cultures. We find it in several other cultures that are beyond the African scope, where children are taught from a young age that it is okay for them to dream, to imagine a world in a certain way, to learn through storytelling, to learn through play, by giving them an experience of learning that is beyond, their wildest imagination. Then we can begin to truly tap into a child's cosmic task, because we have afforded them the opportunity to think, to imagine, and to be filled with awe and wonder.
Yeah, so you are raising one of my favorite words here when we talk about Afrocentric Montessori, the idea of reclamation, that we need to reclaim. And I couldn't help but, remember words of one of my favorite author on the continent, Chinua Achebe. So if I could raise, some of his words, that lions need to have their own historians. And until then, history will always glorify, the hunter, right? In a way, just, trying to speak to this idea that once we don't have ways in which we document our own history, right? The history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, right? So there is a way in which our education in Africa has been experienced through a Eurocentric way, through maybe colonization and even post-colonial ways in which different countries' governments have maintained ways of learning through the Western ways which they thought about Africa and how the Africans should be educated. And what I'm hearing from your introduction into what Afrocentric, Montessori looked like, or rather Afrocentric ways of learning, of knowing, right, looks like when we locate Montessori on the continent. It has the code to reclaim, and you can't reclaim when you actually don't know who you are and your ways of knowing, that you then sort of, resurface and make them sort of exist within this understanding of the child at the center of learning. So Can you help us understand what has happened, right? That which now we are sort of trying to reclaim that which was lost.
Yes, that is the big juicy question that we as African Montessori have tried to unpack. And that question is, what happened to us? I know there's a wonderful book by a very prolific author, which is titled, What Happened to You? And I think that is the question that we ask ourselves. We ask our teachers, we ask our fellows, we ask the students, what happened to you? What has taken place that has devalued or that has uprooted your sense of being? And why is that not reflected in the learning experience? When I reflect on my learning several years ago here in Zimbabwe, I considered the things that I was taught, many of which have made me a very compliant individual in society. But that compliance comes at a very big cost, and that cost is the cost of identity. I struggle to speak in my mother tongue. I often experience myself second guessing whether or not I have a true connection to the land from which I was born. I also think more deeply about whether or not I am actually connected to these African epistemologies, African ways of knowing, African ways of being, because my identity has been so steered toward a certain direction that a lot of those things become elusive and ultimately get lost. So what we're trying to do with the reclamation narrative that we have in African Montessori Hub is to really disrupt the colonial ways of knowing that have become legacies in our education system. I beg your pardon. We actually understand that we are living in a time where remnants of colonial education or colonial curricula are still present in today's education. And we think that that is the number one reason why a number of young people are disconnected from who they are and what they need to be focusing on when it comes to an education that actually truly transforms and liberates. We're also, reminded by these standards, very Western, very Eurocentric standards that currently exist in our education system, that require us to know about European history, that require us to know about Western ways of being, Western landforms, Western, histories and ornaments and landmarks. It's not that these things are not important, but if they supersede our own African repositories of knowledge, our own histories, and our own ways of being, then there is a problem in terms of one's identity and how they can remember it. It is about remembering what we were taught. It is about remembering our own legacy, our own history. And if that continues to experience the erasure of modernity, that is going to be one of the biggest challenges for the African of today. So we continuously ask ourselves, what does the African child need to know today to be able to transform his or her society tomorrow? And that is a society that looks like them, not one where they are uprooted and placed into another. We're talking about societies that actually carry our names, the societies that carry our DNA, the ones that are actually truly in need of transformation. And how are we investing in the child of tomorrow to ensure that when they walk on this earth and they innovate and they think more deeply about themselves and the role that they have to play, they are doing so grounded in the identity of their Africanness, grounded in the identity of the history that they share with several others, and grounded on the collective struggle of ensuring that we have more Black and brown children, more so African children, in spaces that matter, who know themselves and who know what they're capable of doing. That for us becomes the Afrocentric thrust, that becomes the protest, and that becomes the disruption we hope to see taking place when young people in Zimbabwe and across Africa are given an education that actually looks like them, grounded in their culture and in their identity.
You mentioned storytelling and as a powerful tool in which we also teach, within the African culture and practices of learning. And I'm thinking here, like, what if we also use the same, right? Is there a story or an experience that has happened to you that has led you to also to a realization of the importance of rethinking the education for the African child? You introduce yourself as a lawyer, and maybe some of our viewers are wondering, like, how did someone who studied law end up, caring more deeply, Montessori education, the education of the African child, and even the betterment of those who spend time with, the youngest of the young. So what happened to you? What was a moment that you realized that this work was important, in a way also that you also had to, in your big portfolio of things that you're passionate about, also, care deeply about Montessori education, or rather the education of the child?
That's a great question. My Montessori journey was very unusual, very unexpected, because just a few years ago I did not know what Montessori was or where it came from. But a few years back, in the time that I met you, I started thinking deeply about what it takes to educate the African child and what is missing from a great number of curricula. And this occurred to me when I was working in Senegal, in a very big organization that was trying to tackle a very Herculean task of bringing a basic education for children in the capital city of Senegal, which is Dakar, who were often placed in religious schools called daras, for them to receive, the religious education, which was devoid of the basic tenets of a basic education. And so our big task was trying to find a way to include, a basic education within that religious training, so that the children, once they've grown up, are not disadvantaged and at least achieve their full effect of their right to education. This is difficult because we're dealing with a system where a great number of elements exist: the religious factor, the cultural factor, also the location being one of them, the language barrier also being one of them, at least from my end. And having to navigate all of these different structures and barriers required a lot of flexibility and required an education, or at least an approach to education, that could navigate and meander through all these different systems. And in my studies and just looking around, Montessori education became very topical. And as I was doing further reading about it and realizing for myself that this education looks very similar to how I grew up and how many of my peers grew up as well, it reminded me of the time that I was in preschool, and I wondered why the preschool I went to had a very laissez-faire approach. We would enter the school, so to speak, which was actually a home, and we would just do whatever we wanted. And many parents were often confused as to why that was the case. And I did some research to try and figure out if it was a Montessori school or not. But I believe that her approach was already reflective of, and by her I mean the teacher who was in charge of that preschool, her approach was already reflective of the need to allow children to be, to give them the independence, to give them the ability to be curious about the world, to explore for themselves, to give them that freedom within limits, for them to explore the different materials in the room, for them to think deeply about what is on the shelves and what they want to play with at that point in time. So all these things started, becoming very real and vivid for me as I thought about what kind of an education would be sufficient for these children in Dakar, in Senegal. And I then started to think more deeply about how Montessori education allows children to work in a very flexible manner to ensure that they can also be at par with everyone else. And that's essentially what we then employed. We then used the Montessori method to try and bring the children who are already in religious schools up to the level of other children, and to even surpass that. Because at the end of the day, we did not want to erase the cultural significance of their religious education, while also ensuring that they receive a basic education that would allow them to rise up the ranks of education and the system thereof. So it really gave me an interesting approach to that particular challenge, but also enlarged my thinking around what an education, what kind of an education is more suitable for children who are requiring a lot of flexibility, a lot of movement, a lot of inspiration, and how can we make sure that we bring that kind of education to them. So for me, the story here is that I just reflected more deeply about the preschool I went to and found that the way in which we learned at that point in time was very similar to us playing in the roads or in the neighborhoods that we called home. And there was no difference or separation between the preschool and the backyard, or the preschool and the home play area. Because at the end of the day, the same levels of joy, the same levels of play, the same levels of curiosity and imagination were all triggered in all these different spaces. And I remembered just how much I learned even at that point in time. And I believe that that was the key to me understanding Montessori for what it can truly do for children.
I'm thinking about an African proverb that says, the child who's not embraced by the village will burn it to feel its warmth, right? And here you are talking about your story in Senegal and having to work with, children who were, would you say displaced, internally displaced in a way? Right.
100%.
And you had to go through like a remembering of your preschool and your teacher who literally embodied, some of the Montessori ways of thinking about learning and who the child, the idea that even the school itself was in a home. We know that in Montessori, we call it the children's house, that the learning space should be for the children so that they feel that they own the space and everything in them is for them, which I think is what you felt or what you experienced in your preschool. Thank you for sharing that story. What I'm trying to ask next, I think it is this idea of remembering, right? It's something very powerful when we think about Afrocentric ways of knowing. And I want to know, how could you help us understand what's within the Afrocentric ways of knowing that could help us to remember, right? To go back and remember who we are, who the child is, and what learning should look like, that really fits very well when we then think about ways in which we can reimagine education. Because I think to what you said in your story as well was the idea of the education in Zimbabwe, this British education that sort of seek to make students who are very eloquent in the Western culture, so much that you sort of end up struggling with your very own language or other things that are, that identify yourself as Zimbabwean culturally, right? So that education has done so well, so good to what it was meant to do, right? And you are here advocating now for an Afrocentric, Montessori ways of educating the African child. And you're talking about the idea of remembering, right? And we know that even in West African cosmology or cultural understanding, there's the idea of the Sankofa, that we need to go back to be able to move forward. The going back is the remembering, right? That which is then moving forward to what is. So can you really dive a little bit into this idea or this art of remembering in the Afrocentric way as a tenet around the learning that you and African Montessori Hub are really curating for the experience in Africa for the teachers?
100%. And I will highlight the word nostalgia as a portion of why Afrocentric Montessori is very effective at creating a sense of remembrance, not only in the African context, but also in the learning sphere. And I can give you a quick example. We're often told that if you use a particular perfume for a very long time and you abandon it at some point and then you come back to it several years later, something begins to happen once you smell it. You begin to remember a time when you used it and all that essentially transpired at that point in time. And it's the same thing with those who say, when you're studying, if you listen to a certain kind of music, when you're in the exam and that music is played, there's a way in which all of that springs up. There's a way in which the sense, the human sense, can connect so strongly to memories, to remembering. And it may not necessarily be in the context of olfactics, it may not necessarily be in the context of some of the things that we can touch. But what we're realizing more and more with Afrocentric Montessori is that when we were in the doing of things with our parents, with our peers, when we look back and reflect on those experiences, they seem to have a lasting effect on us, a lasting impression on us, because they are things we did with our hands. They're things we did in a very practical way. They are part and parcel of practical life, which is also a key component of Montessori education. The understanding that practical life mimics daily life, even for the adult, makes it that much more impressionable, makes it that much more tangible and practical. Afrocentric Montessori celebrates the fact that we have already been doing this in the homes that we grew up in, when we were with our mothers in the kitchens and cooking, when we were with our fathers in the backyards, or whether it was fixing cars. I mean, these sound very stereotypical, but it's just the remembering of different aspects of our lives that we shared in the doing and in this very physical sense with our parents, with our peers, with our guardians, with our caregivers, that then taught us several crucial things about life. Motor skills, these fine motor skills, taught us about hand-eye coordination, taught us about a great number of skills that we use today.
But Marco, what you're explaining, and sorry to cut you off there, I think it's easy to hear you say it because you've done something that we also maybe need to address so that you can sort of like, explain furthermore into more practical ways of how you were able to do the remembering, right? You sort of were able to decolonize your mind, right? Because you talked about education that in the African context, mostly, I think, if not for all the countries, that really has tried to remove that which we should be remembering in favor of that which we should aspire, right? That's outside the continent, outside our culture, outside our experiences. So can you tell us a little bit about how you were able to decolonize your mind, with what you already, you were very much aware of, your education, your upbringing, your, things that you came in contact with that sort of then brought about this tension around how do I then show up fluently in my mother language when, very eloquent in a second language. Can you give us a little bit quickly around how you, if maybe possible, you're able to decolonize yourself and then tap into the remembering as you now think about it as either a value around Afrocentric Montessori ways of knowing and learning in a Montessori setting?
Yeah, that's a great spin-off. I think two things that I want to share with regards to that, but to answer you very plainly, and maybe I didn't share it at the beginning. I took a human rights path. I went into human rights law as my area of specialization, and that path, by its very nature, asks very deep questions about human worth and what humans are entitled to. And as I was reading more deeply about child's rights and education as a right, a lot of these things are tied to human dignity. And human dignity is great. It is deeply expressed in one's culture and in one's way of showing up in the world. That to deny a person of that cultural expression is to deny them every other right. It's to deny them the right to education. It's to deny them the right to live a fulfilling and meaningful life. It is to deny them anything and everything. It's to deny them their environment, their prepared environment as well. So I understood, at least for me, the action of decolonizing the mind to allow all of this to then make sense came from understanding human dignity and how it is inextricably linked to cultural expression. And so when you remove a person's culture, you've stripped them of their clothing. You've stripped them of the ability to walk into a space, understand it, and make sense of it in a way that develops them. So I think for me, the decolonization of my mind came from understanding the human being, the human worth. And when we put a premium on a human life and the experiences thereof, essentially one's cultural expression and one's cultural experience, we then see all these other things sort of falling into line. Education becomes more meaningful. Anything to do with commerce becomes more meaningful because we're no longer commodifying human beings. We are putting a unique value on the person. And that is why even for us, as we talk about the child, we continue to use the child in that singular sense, say the child, because we must look at each and every child in their individuality, in their singularity, rather. I think that's the better word. So that their culture, their traditions, their ways of being, ways of knowing can attach on that individual as they form part of the whole. And I think that's where for me that the decolonization essentially started. The other thing that I wanted to mention with regards to that is once we've accepted that the culture is inextricably linked with every other right, be it education, health, whatever, we also need to understand that as we put a worth to the human person, we must be willing to accept the entirety of the culture. It is not enough for us to accept that when a child is young, they must be able to cook sadza, and they should be able to sweep their room, and they should be able to, go to the fields with the other peers to herd cattle. And also deny the fact that at a certain point in their life, they should also be involved very deeply in other rites of passage, in other cultural expressions. The culture is a very big package. We cannot pick and choose. But what we at least try to do is to honor everything that a person's culture entails, because that is where we derive their worth. Once we are very aware of a person's culture, we're better able to also understand their worth, and we're better able to also give them an education that reflects the importance of that being. Oftentimes, the education that we've received, especially, education that came out of colonial rule, is that it was always trying to dehumanize, to empty the African of his culture, to empty the African of his language, to empty him of the significance of a burial process, of a marital process, of a coming of age process, because it looked at all of those things as subpar to civilization. And so the education followed. That is why the education that the African receives during that time was only meant to look at them as someone who was contributing to the workforce, to the industry, to the industrial plants. It had nothing to do with actually edifying them as a human being who was blessed with their entire cultural expression. That is why it then becomes important for us to decolonize the mind by starting with the understanding that one must accept the entire cultural repertoire as it is, and also realize that by giving people the ability to express their own culture, their own ways of being, their own Africanness, we then give them an education that is fitting of their development, fitting of their transformation. Because when you separate those two things, we then end up with very well-trained young boys and young girls who are so articulate in the English language, but who lack any connection to the land, to their culture, and to their people.
Yeah, well, I think I'm excited to bring you back and the other educators on the continent to really talk about decolonization. I think it is in itself its own, conversation that needs to be heard. So that we can fully understand some of the initiatives that you're doing with AMH and others also on the continent around reimagining education for the African child. I'm thinking about, some of the people that are not situated on the continent of Africa, right? That when they think about Afrocentric Montessori, or in other words in which maybe some people try to frame it as diversity or as inclusion, right? In their classrooms or in our classrooms, and I can speak to what I've observed in the United States, is that we end up thinking about, African artifacts as something we can place, to your point, in practical life shelves, on sensorial shelves, on math shelves, as we're doing the work. You go to Ghana and you see these very nice baskets. You go to Zimbabwe, you see all this little nice cute, spoons or fabric that you then bring back into your classroom, and you say, oh gosh, I am doing Afrocentric Montessori. See, it looks as exactly that. What would you say to people to really understand, and quickly, the deeper meaning of Afrocentric as it's reflected or lived through within our classrooms or learning spaces?
I can liken it to me buying allspice and saying that I've become a master at Chinese cuisine. It is just not true. And the fact that it's in my kitchen does not give me the pedigree of being a Chinese chef. And so I think that's what many schools are doing. It is the assumption, or at least even the ignorance, that if I have a little bit of it, I have it all. And we hope that many teachers out there allow themselves to become students once again of different ways of knowing, and to be very intentional about what it means to learn, or at least to create a space that allows for an Afrocentric way of learning to exist in that learning space. It is an embellishment to have little ornaments of a giraffe and a hippo, and say I acquired these from South Africa, and for someone to then say that makes my class diverse, or that makes my class Afrocentric and inclusive, because you are merely ticking a box of what it looks like, but not embracing the true essence of what it means to have a classroom that is deeply invested in creating an inclusive and enriching experience for the child. So it is an embellishment, to say it very plainly, and we ask teachers, as African Montessori have, to do better, to think deeper about what it means to give children an authentic experience. And where you cannot create one for yourself, invite others who are able to help you create it. We are all about collaboration and co-creation. We know that no one person knows everything. But that's why it's important for us to continuously bring one another into these spaces, so that they can be more reflective of the experiences that other people have had, or that other people are better able to curate. I think that's what the power of collaboration can actually do.
Thank you so much. Again, it's one thing that I think would definitely invite you back to really dive into how do we really design classroom that are living and breathing, Afrocentric ways of knowing for the African child, so that when people visit spaces on the continent, they don't just see another reflection of a classroom in Denver, another reflection of a classroom in London or Amsterdam, but a Montessori classroom in Zimbabwe should look like a Montessori classroom in Zimbabwe, right? And I think that that's some of the work and some of the stuff that you started teasing out here today for us to start thinking about, and start learning from you and with you together here on the Montessori Mic podcast. So to close us off, do you have a sentence that you would construct that you'd want our viewers to sort of live with, right? And think about actively as they reflect on this conversation that we just had today. Started off with you finishing some of the questions that we had on the Montessori Mic, and I'm sure that you do also have a sentence of yourself about the African child or the classroom or whatever that you would want us to sort of, noodle as we reflect on your conversation here today.
Thank you, Tatenda. And this is a question I often say, not even a question, a statement I often say in a great number of spaces, that we all have a responsibility to ensure that the African child succeeds. We all have a responsibility, and it's incumbent on us and what we do today to ensure that the African child succeeds. And the sooner we take up that responsibility, the sooner our society transforms. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Makomborero. And again, thank you for gracing us with your presence, your knowledge, your experiences on what Afrocentric Montessori is and should be and look like. I know that this 45 minutes didn't do justice, but again, we hope to bring you back so that we can really dive more into some of the things that you brought up here today. We wish you a restful day as you just got off a trip. And again, thank you so much for making time. Hopefully we get to catch you up, soon, wherever you find yourself next time, tuning into this podcast with us. But again, thank you.